Welcome to the second week of Odyssey of the Apocalypse. And certainly that's what St. John's Revelation is, an odyssey, a fantastic and remarkable inner journey that will take place in every human being, sometime, someplace, in which the human being is translated or transformed from human to divine, or from human to angel, if we'd like to use those words. We left off last week with a look at the tabernacle in the wilderness, the room of the holy and the holy of the holies, which dealt with the inner worlds of the soul and the raising of the dead, or the raising of the spiritual nature as the Ark of the Covenant is opened, or the spiritual nature in every man, woman, and child. We will take a review look at Moses' tabernacle in a short time. But if you remember, the teachings of Moses laid the foundation for what was later known as Hebrew Kabbalah. And Hebrew Kabbalah represented the secret teachings of Hebrew. From Hebrew Kabbalah was born, of course, Hebrew mysticism. And from Hebrew mysticism was born Christian mysticism, or the mysteries, the secret teachings of Christianity. And certainly, St. John's Revelation encompasses the totality of the very heart and crux of the Christian mysteries. And the Vatican, back in the formulating days, and we covered this last week, it was decided that the mysteries would not be given to the mass consciousness. This was understandable, because thousands, most people in the world could not read or write. And so they were kept in the protective custody that gradually, after the Vatican became not a mystery school any longer, but more of a political figure, and began to gain control over the other countries of the world, it lost the very beautiful foundation that had been such an integral part of the Vatican. Now we take a look at Revelation, which was put into the canons. Then they had a conclave and decided to take it out. They put it back in, and it is there to remain. And certainly, as you well know, everything in Revelation is not as it seems. Everything means something else. It's almost as bad as Moses' Hebrew. And last week I had neglected to bring down the Hebrew tongue restored, but this week I did, by Fabre d'Olivet, to point out to you that the cosmogony of Moses was in reality a mystical writing that was given by a man who illumined on Mount Sinai. Moses was more than just the leader of the people of Israel. He was truly one of the ground masters. St. John, of course, also is one of the great masters of antiquity, because John is not the martyred saint that most people make him out to be. He instead had made that transformation from human to divine. That's why he was called St. John the Divine, St. John the Beloved. He had illumined probably prior to going to the Isle of Patmos, but certainly many of his experiences and the primary basis of the writings of Revelation came during his sojourn and imprisonment on Patmos. In the cosmogony of Moses, Moses also talks about 7 days of creation, which leads us back to the numbers that I was telling you about last week. There are 2 sets of numbers that you must remember, and remember well, as we go through the Odyssey, because those numbers form the foundation of Odyssey of the Apocalypse, or St. John's Revelation. I'm going now to the blackboard as we take one more last look at Moses' tabernacle in the wilderness. I'm then going to remove this, and we're going to look at these numbers. And I think that we will look first at the long sequence of numbers before we look at the 7 phases of creation. And the primary reason for this is because I want to show you the numbers of the 144,000 and this sign of the beast, 666. You will be indeed so surprised. I'm sorry, I had mentioned we were going to take one more last look at this. Remember last week I said that the outer court represented actually the people. It was here that people could gather, just as they can gather in a congregation at church. And then normally the minister is up on a stage or a raised area, and he has before him the altar, and on the altar sits the Holy Bible. By opening the Holy Bible, he represents and signifies the 3rd phase, or the 3rd room called the Holy of the Holies, which housed the Ark of the Covenant. So thus the outside parameters meant and represented the body. The inside represented the soul. The very interior here represents the room, the Holy of the Holies. And as we look at this here, you notice that we have what is called the sacrificial bed. Well, it is actually behind the water, or perhaps the water's in front of it. I think it depends on which direction you're coming from. Of course, the intent was to give the sacrifice and then for the high priest to wash his hands. But this represented also the sacrifice of our corporeal world. By this it doesn't mean that we have to die and leave the corporeal world, but our attachments bring to us so much unhappiness. When we get them, we are happy. They grow old, we don't want them anymore. We have broken relationships, broken homes. Things are so difficult. We work at jobs that we do not like. We work at it because we have to live and have a roof over our heads. So the result is we have many attachments which hold us into the corporeal world and do not allow us to understand our inner and divine nature. As we go through the resurrection of the dead, that is one of the greatest parts of the whole thing, is that inside of every human being is this magnificent seed of greatness, which is called in Revelation the indwelling Christ. And it is He, that part of God which He gave just to you and I. We each have an individualized aspect of this. And so it is this which it holds and contains the seed of greatness. We've all had this wonderful dream of someday being known or famous or great. And I assure you, greatness is not an outer thing. True greatness is an inner thing, as we've seen by people like Jesus the Christ and Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Beethoven. Inner is where the greatness is. But nevertheless, everybody has this, and from the very beginning of time, God created all people equal, so that one day, sometime in the right time for them and for Him, they would be the great ones upon earth. And that would finish then their human progression. We're going to prove this as we move on through Odyssey of the Apocalypse. But that's what we need to remember. So by sacrificing the things that are causing us unhappiness, we rise at last to the peace and joy and tranquility that we have always dreamed about, as well as to that seed of greatness that exists inside of all mankind. So this not only was actually the place where they sacrificed animals, but it represented, the 4 horns represented the 4 elements, which bound man to matter through the fires of purification. And you're going to find that as we go through St. John's Revelation, that the fires of purification is an inner fire that burns and burns and burns away everything which is gross, everything which hinders us from the very blissful world that we could live in. and everything that separates us one from another. So it had a dual meaning, because as they sacrificed the animal, then the soul, purified by fire, would be freed from the four elements to rise up to heaven. And so this represented the purification of the soul through sacrifice. This represented the purification of the body. And you're going to see that bodily purification is important also, because this great light in us is a vibrational frequency that is so much higher than we are in human form. And the more dense the body is, the greater the Armageddon battle between mortal and immortal. So the body is also purified to become the fit temple for the living God, so that He will descend to live, and that the soul can become the bridegroom of the indwelling Christ, and the final marriage which completes the cycles of rebirth are completed. Therefore, this is some of the outer meaning here. And then, of course, Moses left two things to illustrate the soul. One was a seven-pronged candlestick, which we are going to see later on, represented the seven epochs of creation. And we, as you will find as we go through Revelation, the seventh epoch is barely beginning to dawn. And that we, as mankind, have yet thousands of years ahead of us to complete the monumental task of bringing this planet to peace, which we can only do through the higher consciousness of our future world. Here is 12 loaves of shewbread, but they're broken in two piles of 6. And you're going to understand that a little bit better as we proceed through the numbers, because this represents the soul, which is bound by the four elements to dwell with the body in the corporeal world. The other 6 loaves, and by the way, the 6 not only in the corporeal world, but you're going to see in the 7 cycles of creation that 6 is the number of man. And the other represents, the 6 loaves, represents the embodiment of this great divine and inner nature of the Christ, who is also bound with the soul to the corporeal world of matter. And these two must become one. It is that which is the holy marriage, the perfect marriage, the dream that is in the heart of every soul, whether it is male or female. So Moses, for this, left the 12 loaves of shewbread. There was also an incense container here, but I'm not going into this. Later episodes, I have decided that in the next series, we will do the secret teachings of Moses called Covenant at Sinai. But anyway, then we have back here, of course, that Ark of the Covenant, which is that indwelling Christ, the inner spirit, which lives in all mankind. So with that, that's a little bit of the basis of the mysteries. And even though it was Mosaic, or the teachings of Moses, it still laid the framework for Christianity, because nothing has changed. We could take the measurements of Moses' tabernacle in the wilderness. We could break them into feet and inches in English language, and they would have the same symbolic meaning as the measurement of the pyramid broken into feet and inches of the English language. No, the measurements don't measure the same, but they come out the same numbers representing the same thing, because the ancient pyramid also represented a transfiguration. And the cone of the pyramid was missing because it represented man in the wilderness who had not yet united the body and soul and spirit. All right, as we go into, and now I've changed my mind because I've decided we will have to look at the 7 figures first, and I hope that you're not going to get confused between these 2 series of numbers. So I hope that if you have a pencil and paper, that you will get it and you will write them down. So that you're going to need them. They're all the way through the Apocalypse. They're going to be very helpful to you if you should write them down. The 7-pronged candlestick of Moses, as I said, represented the 7 epochs of creation. And so as a result is, the first manifestation was light. And then from light to matter. Now I know this isn't going to seem quite the same as King James Version of Genesis, but it is the same as the original Hebrew. Moses' cosmogony is so absolutely involved and intricate. That's why I'm going to hold a series on it a little later. Light to matter. First it was darkness to light. That was day one. Day two represented light to matter. In other words, when creation began, it was a manifestation of light of consciousness, which gathered together substance from outer space to bring into the world the myriad and multitudes of suns, S-U-N-S. And so not only was there light of consciousness, but this light of consciousness took upon itself a multitude of clothes or a multitude of suns. These suns being built in this light of consciousness as a reflection of the inner light. So light was day one. And then, of course, as the planet flowed into outer space, against this hot, molten mass of sunlight, flowing into outer space, it became cooled down and cold, and the rains came, and from it, it formed a suit of clothes, which we call the surface of the earth. So light to matter, and matter became then the second day. Once there was matter, there could become that wonderful journey of vegetation. I'm sorry, from matter came vegetation. We don't want to miss that, because the world of plant life, vegetative. The world of plant life has sustained us since the beginning and will continue to sustain us. And I don't know whether you've ever seen the Time Life series, but they indicate that at the beginning of our planet, the first sea life looked almost like a tree, and it stood 50 feet high as a kind of a cone-shaped structure. So vegetation was here long before there were fish and fowl. And once the rains came, the seas began to create life within themselves, and the moisture that sunk into the land created the trees and plants that would be edible enough for our planet's beginning. Then and only then did fish and fowl come forward. And I kind of grouped them together because they pretty much came simultaneously. You can see a strong resemblance, if you've ever seen the Time Life progression of evolution. Fish and fowl had similarities in those days. We go back, say, 350 or 400 million years ago. Then from fish and fowl came along animal. By the way, vegetative was the third day, fish and fowl was the fourth day. And then we come to animal, and that was the fifth day. And this becomes really confusing, because when we're doing Genesis, they have the moon and the sun as being the greater light and the lesser light. But that's not true at all. The greater light is that which is the light of consciousness. The lesser light is the manifestation of the light of the sun, meaning that is lesser than the light of consciousness which created it. And from the sun would come all things known as matter or darkness and unknowingness. So when it speaks of the separation of the greater and lesser light, it was interpreted by later people, actually 1,000 years of Greek translation and 3 English translations, to say that the sun, the moon came after the sun, or something like that. But that, of course, is not true, and that's why we're so grateful for translations of original Hebrew of Moses' cosmogony. So animal was a fifth cycle, because Homo sapien came about over 40,000 years ago, and prior to that, half animal and half part animal and part human has existed for over 10.5 million years. And so it took a long time, and I assure you, there were no humans on the planet preceding the animal. So animal represented the sixth day, and then our fifth day. And from animal then came forth man, at last, who would have control over all of earth. He would grow vegetative food to feed himself and his family. He would catch fish and take care of fowl. He would rule over the animals. They would serve him as he harnessed the earth. So man was a tremendously remarkable thing. When man came forth about 10 million, probably a little over 10 million years ago. As I said, he was a little bit more animal perhaps than man at that time. And so that represented the sixth cycle or six epochs. And don't think for one moment you can ever separate creationism and evolution. Moses' theory was on creationism. Darwin's theory was on evolution. The light that is in us draws together the substance to provide for us a body to express our current level of development. So we never skip a grade. So that light that is in us has ascertained that we have earned the right of human life, but at the same time we haven't risen beyond it yet. So the reason you and I are wearing human embodiment is because we have not yet risen and passed through the transformation of human to divine, or the resurrection of the dead. Thus it was that the man of beast represented, man himself represented 666, meaning that the mind or body was bound to the sixth phase of creation, human. And we say body because certainly we're not animal. We may have animal characteristics, and we may be described as animal and mammal and all of this, but in reality, the body is now human. So we are bound, the body, physical structure, our physical structure is bound to the world of matter. Our soul dwells with the physical body here on earth, also bound to the world of matter. And that great indwelling Christ, that great light that has dwelled in us since the beginning of time, also has been bound by the world of matter to walk with the soul and be the light within the soul to steer it through the process of progression that the soul would need to pass through. And so it too is bound. So when we see 666, the mark of the beast, merely means that we are human, and that our soul and our spirit is also bound to matter. So much for the beast. Kind of a poor name, isn't it, really, for man? All right, and then the seventh cycle, this represented the sixth. And with Moses's, then there would be this. We've covered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now the seventh would be the day when spirit and soul would come to union. The seventh epoch, when, excuse me, I always throw my erasers. The seventh epoch when God and the soul become one. And so there is no completion of human progression till we have successfully accomplished this. And I'm glad to say that as we approach the dawning of the seventh epoch, this is taking place. Birth in mankind is beginning and will bring unto us one of the most remarkable ages as we bid farewell to earth. A few thousand years from now, I'm afraid. The next 2,000 years have been signified Aquarius, water, purification, purification of the human world, purification of the mortal. All right, those are the seven that we will be running into a great deal. And we will have to take these same numbers now. We'll have to do something a little bit different with them. We're going to have to separate the lesser mysteries from the higher mysteries, because that too plays an important role. So I will erase these, and we will prepare to absolutely confuse you perhaps with the second set of numbers, meaning somewhat similar and yet a little bit different. So we're going to begin in a different way, and we're going to use Roman numerals because that's the easiest way. I think Roman numerals express the process so much better than anything else. And it was discovered, as you know, by Pythagoras, and that was before, certainly before the time of Christ, that numbers could explain everything. And so, and his mystery school at Crotona, Pythagoras taught music and mathematics as well as the mysteries. So one represents, of course, the matter of light coming from darkness, just as we saw before. He is known as He. And the women sometimes get very offended when I call God He, but I don't know what to call God. You see, the word God is neutral. It comes from the word good, that everything that exists is good, if we understand it and see it with eyes clearly. So that is neutral, neither male nor female, and God is neither male nor female. So it is that He brought forth the light manifestation, He, its, or whatever you want to call. In Hebrew, of course, it was law, capital L, and that probably was a good neutral description, but nevertheless, Jesus referred to God as He, so I have a habit of doing the same thing. Light, a consciousness, light of consciousness. Nothing could exist before light existed. So out of God's own body, He wove a suit of light. That part of Him would be light and part of Him would not be light. That part of Him which is not light sustains that part in Him which is light. That was called light of consciousness. And it was from that that all life began, right down to the very minute atoms and protons and neutrons. So light was kind of the beginning, light of consciousness, which was separated then from the unmanifested, or that part of God which sustains all life. Now light would build upon itself a suit of clothes. It would take upon itself the manifestation and build within it. God had built within Himself the light of consciousness. Now the light, which has been called by many names, but which we call in the Western world in modern times, Christ, the light of consciousness, the light of God in every human being. In India they call it Krishna, Krishna consciousness. In Buddhism it's called Buddhahood. And in Western world, as I said, it is called Christ or Christ consciousness. But anyway, this consciousness, this light manifestation, would create within Himself the manifestation of the universe. So we begin then from light to the world of matter. So the first suns, probably in a great population explosion, not a population explosion, but the Big Bang Theory, probably millions or thousands of suns began in the beginning. I don't know, you see, because I don't remember having been there, but I have to take for granted there wasn't a single sun, there were probably many. And then from, as light began to dwell with the world of matter, it would take, let's take matter away. Maybe that's a little confusing. Let us say light, the light had to take upon itself, I hate to put the sun, I don't want to put matter because that's going to confuse you, because this light must take upon himself a bride, and that bride is going to be the soul. Let's just say light and sun. In this manner, because it is the light of consciousness which is going to give birth to the totality of creation, and that is known as the Son of God. So we would call that the Son. I don't want to call it Spirit, the Father, but we'll just call it Son. And then the soul. But the soul, in order to go through the progression, it would be necessary for the Son to incarnate through the soul gather together the four elements known as matter. And those, if you want to know, are earth and fire, water and air. It is said that all things are this composite. And it's also interesting that as we proceed on through St. John's Revelation, that the earthly nature would be purified like water, and the soul would be purified by fire, and together they would become airborne or one in God. Also, if we were to twist this, that would square the cross. Well, anyway, we're not going to get into that. But this inverted V represents the descent of the soul and the Son to live in the world of matter. So now we can, I think, earth, let's call this descend. Now, having gathered together the four elements, the physical body was born from this, or the mortal countenance. So having gathered together the four elements, the soul, the Son and the soul, the Son of God, and the soul are now well encased into this descent. Five, the two natures now are fully descended. And there will be no way up for them except through the return to the one God, to the return of the light. So, as it is, six then represented embodiment of the Son of God and the soul into flesh. And this was always considered in the great mystery schools of antiquity as the lesser mysteries, how we became human. And these we read far more often than how to rise and become one with God. Those represent what is called the higher mysteries. And that is where I go to now. Remember, we must free ourselves from this descent by ascending, and so we will enter the seventh epoch. I'll erase this, but put down right at this point on your paper, lower mysteries. How man became. How man became human, if we want to put it that way. All right, now we will go to what are classified as the higher mysteries. And you're going to hear those numbers that we just covered and the ones we're going to cover next. You're going to hear them again and again and again, because this is the very basic foundation of St. John's Revelation. All right, 7. That means that the two selves, the soul and the Son of God, must work diligently to become one in order to leave ascension. So the seventh epoch of creation, which represents this, is also represented as the first stage of the higher mysteries. So the two must now resurrect. But they cannot do this. The two cannot become one without the horrendous battle. So 8 has always been looked upon as the war number, the number of the great Armageddon battle, the 144,000. Because the 144,000, of course, does not represent a quantity, but a state of consciousness. So let us see how the 144 comes out. 1 signifies, of course, the one God. The Son of God and the soul must raise themselves from human embodiment. Both are bound by the 4 elements to matter. We've already shown you that, as we did in the descent of the Son of God to dwell in the flesh, to create his bride. Now in raising from here, this shows the 4 and the 4. And now they're separated. So in order to raise this divine spark, we must release it from its embodiment to matter, restore it to its heavenly abode, and he then must descend to take over the soul and guide it through its release from its attachments of the corporeal or mortal world. Now, that may have seemed to be a strange statement, but we have at least another 24 weeks after this, and by that time, I'm sure you will fully understand this. So 144,000 can only be done by the two selves returning to the one God through the union of the body, of the soul, with the Spirit. So 144,000 are those who enter unto the resurrection of the dead, or the transformational change, or have achieved the transformational change. And you say, but nobody's passed through the resurrection of the dead. How wrong you are. Because cosmic consciousness, or fusion with the finite mind, with the mind of God, opens that massive gateway that leads in to the resurrection of the dead. We have great women who have reached it, such as Peace Pilgrim, Mother Teresa, Einstein, Jacques Cousteau. And we say, but sometimes, but look at their lives. Yes, I think we all have to admit that Einstein and Cousteau left a great and noble work, as did the great woman master Peace Pilgrim, or the great woman mystic Peace Pilgrim, Ogama-sama of Japan. But when we look in Beethoven's life, or Leonardo da Vinci, or Michelangelo, we're not prone to think of them as having resurrected. But they were passing through the judgment time. Because the two selves will battle. The battlefield will be the soul, and that will be Megiddo, as you will find out. And the battle is long and arduous. Not a day, not a week, not an hour. The battle of Armageddon takes many years. The transformation of human to divine is not gained easily. And yet, it is not impossible, because the divine spark, the light, has been raised and will walk with the soul through its journey. So the 144,000. You can see the intricacies of the numbering system of St. John's Revelation. So, now, the two selves descended. Now they have ascended. This is known as rebirth. Many people believe that rebirth is the acceptance of Jesus as their Savior. Believe me, that is the infant toddler's first step, or one of the steps, because I do not wish in any way to imply that transformational change from human to divine is relegated only to the Christian world. But each one of the philosophies and each one of the religions has their own peculiarities and explanations. I was reared Christian and entered the mysteries as a Christian. So therefore, I'm much more familiar with this, to use the Christian terms. Now, we're not saying that when we accept Jesus as your Savior, I think I was 12 years old, when we accept Jesus as our Savior, I'm not saying that something special doesn't happen and that we're not reborn to be a little bit more than we were yesterday. But if we were to look at those levels, we have to remember levels that we looked at in the last series that we had, which pertained to the great Via Dolorosa. We had here mass consciousness. We had a doorway. And this doorway would then relegate the person to a higher order or devotee. So when a person has taken Jesus as their Savior, they definitely enter a stage that's a little bit higher than where they were and where mass consciousness may be. And in a way, it is a rebirth, but it is not the rebirth. Now, from this world here, devotee, the devotee becomes tired of the disciplines of just simply devotion, but they want to get out to teach and to preach and to do something for the world. And so there is then a higher level. And it is this level here, which is called probationer in very simple terms. called probationer, in which this devotee is tried to see if they are worthy to enter the sacred gate of the resurrection, known as the narrow gate, where many are called and few are chosen. And I put 2 steps out here, and we'll explain those some other time because they have to do with well, I guess I can explain them. The first, Jesus was, of course, suffered the war with Lucifer on Mount Quarantana. And as a result of this, each person fights with Lucifer. And you're going to find out that Lucifer is not a being, he is not a consciousness, he is not a separate power. You're going to find out that he is your own lower nature. And then in the next step, we have where Jesus was scourged before the crucifixion. There are a number of experiences and tests that are given to the probationer or person that is walking the path, or however we want to call it, is given at that time to see if they are yet ready. I cannot say to find out if they are worthy, because every person is going to go through this sometime, and every person will be found worthy sometime. So let us say ready. The reins of the heart are strongly looked at. Tests, experience are given so that we understand and know exactly what what is valuable in our life. And it is known as the scourging. Passing these 2, it is determined by the great angelic kingdom and archangelic kingdom, and above all, the great master himself, whether the student is ready to approach his feet or ready to approach him on a level far superior and beyond the level of mortality. So, and we'll take a look at this gate. We looked at it in the Via Dolorosa, and we will take a look at it again as we get a little nearer to the time where it becomes really, truly important to us. So 9 represents the true rebirth. When the Spirit, when descended, of course, we all know we descended. So now as we ascend, having ascended our return to one, we are reborn, not as reborn in accepting Jesus as a Savior, not reborn as trying to become a preacher or a minister for the world, but in reality, reborn from human to divine. This has been 10. It is always represented the perfect number, infinite wisdom, because they have returned at last to oneness. Rebirth is complete. Oneness now is a state of being. And by the way, the Masonic emblem of the Masonic temple of a Master Mason is that Spirit descends, Spirit ascends, interlocked, victorious mastership over human life and oneness with the divine counterpart. And so that's almost exactly the same here as it is as the X is. The next 3 numbers, we cover them, but they're little 11, 10, 11, just simply means that the 2 selves have returned to one. Here they are united. Now they're returning to one. And the 2, 12. The 2, having become one, now has entered the world of mastership. They will never again face the human life. Well, those are the 12 numbers. It's also going to be those 12 numbers going to represent mountains of the material that we will be covering in St. John's Revelation. Let me erase this board, go back to my chair, and I know now that you're completely ready for the very first step of the adventure. Before we go to the very first step of the adventure, perhaps I can introduce you to a few books. Not books, books that you've seen before. We have already introduced Hebraic Tongue Restored in which on the seventh day, it says in here, on the seventh day, God restored the world. Let's see. God came forth in all mankind and restored the world. And, of course, we talked about this last week, but I didn't have it down. This was the gospel of peace. This was the secret teachings of Jesus pertaining the purification of the body and the purification of the soul. What we eat and so on is a part of the purification of the physical body. The communions with the angels, which were the forces of natural and cosmic law, would help the soul to purify in its journey toward transformation. It's the only part of Jesus' teachings that we have which pertains to the method by which we can accomplish the resurrection of the dead. And perhaps it is for this reason that the Vatican has held it in its protective custody ever since it was first written. It was written originally in Aramaic by John the Beloved. I do not know at what point he wrote it. I must assume it was after he was released from his imprisonment on Patmos. But nevertheless, we are greatly honored by the fact that Professor Zeke, who did the translation during his studies in the Roman Vatican, spoke 15 languages. He always said 14 and a half because he always claimed he never learned the English language. But he was a brilliant man, and I had the privilege of studying with him the last 5 years of his life, and what brought us together was my search for the real Jesus and his search for what made him what he was. And eventually, while I was on my first United States lecture tour, we were brought together. So that's it. This is very important in helping to break Revelation, but its most important work is it gives us a way and means by accomplishing the resurrection. There is always some question on whether, of course, John wrote, the same John that wrote the Gospel of John and wrote Revelation, whether they were one and the same. And I assure you, with everything that's in me, I've spent years and years, over a quarter of a century, in the most intense research you can possibly imagine. So intense was my research, and you may not, some people may not even believe this, but you know how you get a Charlie horse in your leg, kind of a cramp, and your leg sometimes will not up. I was so intense in my research at one point, my brain actually did this one morning, and I said, I felt this thing just knot up inside my head. And I said, I must lessen my intensity of this research. But I can assure you that John of the Gospel and John of Revelation are one and the same, because the Gospel of John could have been written only by a master, and Revelation could have only been written by someone who passed through the resurrection of the dead. So no doubt they're written by the same one. John also wrote in here, there's called the Acts of John. I do not know how much of this we take literally. In a sense, it has not been purified as our Bible has, because our Bible has been moderated, it has been interpreted, it has been translated again and again and again. So we have such a watered down version from the original, and these have not been purified, and most ministers don't want to accept the Apocrypha New Testament, but to me I do, because it fills in many facts, and because I myself have walked the path of the Via Dolorosa and have entered that great hall of transformation, I can tell what is true and what isn't. So he also wrote the Acts of John. So we have John the Beloved, who is known to be the most accurate of containing or presenting the Master's teachings. So many people hold to the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but they cannot touch the scholarly work of John, because John stood heads and shoulders in consciousness above them. This is just another form of the Apocryphal New Testament, written by someone else. And you will be, of course, very surprised perhaps to find out that John was not the only one to do an apocalypse. It became apparently quite fashionable among the disciples, because we have the apocalypse of Peter, we have the apocalypse of Paul, we have the revelation of Stephen. Anyway, so there are 3 others, but I choose to ignore them. I swore when I completed St. John's Revelation, I would never again do another revelation or another apocalypse. Jesus said to them, and do not worry, you will not open your Bibles till the very beginning of next week, but Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, when you make the 2 one, now you understand what that means. When you make the 2 one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male and the female not be female, then you shall enter the kingdom of heaven. Because when you are one with God, there is in the soul, it is neither male nor female. God is neither male nor female. The Christ consciousness, the great light, is neither male nor female. So as we open the very first pages of the Apocalypse, we come to the first scripture, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show his servant things which must shortly come to pass. He sent and signified it by his angel and unto his servant John. In the process of cosmic consciousness, and I promise that each of you, when you reach inside instead of outside, and you raise that divine nature of you to recognize the glory of which you really are, it will be revealed to you the totality of the divine plan of God. This will change you from mediocrity into greatness. And perhaps through this course, we will be just one more step closer to that day when you will perceive the fulfillment of your dream and the greatness that you bear. I'll be with you next week. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank you for being with us during this exciting journey into St. John's Apocalypse. Jesus once said, there shall be no peace among people till there be one garden of the brotherhood over earth. So come, let you and I work together for this common cause, that the great age of mankind can come into existence. Until we meet again, peace be with you.